Awesome. Thanks again, Fred. Awesome presentation. I've had the privilege of recently meeting our next speaker online and got to preview some of his presentations. So we're really looking forward to this. So I'm going to welcome Mr. Salvador Cordova to the chat.
Greetings and honor to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Is it my time yet? We have 30 more seconds for Fred. Otherwise, I could start early.
I say go for it, Sal. I'm looking forward to your presentation. You always got great stuff.
Thank you, Fred.
I'll defer my 1 minute left.
Greetings to everyone this Saturday afternoon. Thank you for being a part of this presentation. I'm Salvador Cordova. Glory and honor to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, who is also our creator and intelligent designer. Pictured here, let me get my pictures going. Pictured on in my slides, on the left is the April 28, 2005 cover of the prestigious scientific journal Nature, exploring the question, is intelligent design coming to your campus? The answer, by the way, is yes. I was honored to be featured prominently in the cover story, and there is a picture of yours truly in that story. Let me zoom in on the cover of this edition. It says, evolution by natural selection is a theory, not a fact. Now, do the editors of Nature really believe that? Of course not. So why did they put that on the cover? They were mocking the Cobb County Public School Board that had put these anti-evolution warning stickers on the public school textbooks, such as the one on the right. But the Cobb County affair has been mostly lost to history. And so in an attempt to mock intelligent design without realizing it, the editors of this scientific journal actually told it like it is on the cover. Among many things, the cover story reported on how I nearly lost my Christian faith, but was restored to Christian faith through the study of intelligent design and also through people like Jerry Bergman, who was at this summit. The story also reports names that might be familiar to some of you, like Casey Luskin, Carolyn Crocker, and Stephen Meyer. All three of them were featured in the 2008 motion picture starring Ben Stein. The picture was Expelled, which played in theaters across the USA. And more about Stephen Meyer later. I should mention the story also reported the results of an informal poll I commissioned at one university, which indicated 75% of students polled said they would be interested in taking a college course on intelligent design and/or creationism. Intelligent design and creationism are distinct fields of inquiry, but do have a lot of overlap. And many students wanted to take college courses in both intelligent design and creationism. By the way, I'm working on developing such courses with the hope that students who are allowed to get college credit for self-directed study will take my free of charge courses online and get college credit for studying these courses on intelligent design and creationism. In 2005, it was fashionable to mock people like ID proponent Stephen Meyer and others who were skeptical of Darwinism. But in 2025, 20 years later, that no longer is quite so fashionable. Case in point, in 2025, famous evolutionary biologist Brett Weinstein said, modern Darwinism is broken. My Darwinist colleagues are lying to themselves, ID proponent Stephen Meyer is a scientist who is actually quite good. Now, a little bit about my background prior to my biophysics work. I worked as a senior engineer in the aerospace and defense industry for MITRE and the Army Night Vision Labs. MITRE stands for Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Research, and Engineering, but there is a joke that MITRE really stands for MIT's Rejected Engineers. I specifically work for MITRE Center for Advanced Aviation Systems Development. MITRE sent me off to flight school so I could understand my job as an engineer in the aerospace industry better. As an aside, I wanted to be a concert pianist, but it's hard to make a living doing that, so that's how I became an engineer. As far as my education, MS in biology, MS in applied physics from Johns Hopkins University. I have 5 science degrees working on a 6th, PhD in progress in biomolecular engineering. So how did I, an engineer, end up getting involved in biology and biophysics? First of all, even evolutionary evangelists and diehard Darwinists like Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins advocate the view that biology is engineering. They are wrong about Darwinism being the engineer rather than God, but they are correct to say biology is engineering. Because biology is engineering, engineers have the right skill set to help us understand biology, as evidenced by this MIT newsletter. 1/3 of the engineers at MIT now work on biological problems, according to Graham C. Walker, MIT biology professor. After I left MITRE, I was eventually hired by John Sanford to work on biology projects because, not in spite of, my engineering background. John Sanford is a famous geneticist, genetic engineer. His invention, the gene gun, pictured above, helped feed starving billions by increasing the agricultural output of crops around the world. He is also a retired tenured research professor from Cornell, an Ivy League school. The gene gun made him famous, so much so that a few examples of the gene gun are featured at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. Dr. Sanford had once been an atheist, but then became a Christian, and then a believer in ID, and then eventually a creationist. He was profoundly influenced by the book Darwin's Black Box by Michael Behe. He and I published peer-reviewed scientific works through respected publishers such as Springer Nature and Oxford University Press. We pass peer review despite the fact that we are critical of evolutionary theory, and our work is now on the library shelves of secular universities. I'll occasionally refer to some of these publications in this presentation today. We will talk about the amazing designs in biology which modern science has discovered, but because human suffering and the evils of the world can drown out our ability to perceive and appreciate God's designs, I'll cover the problem of evil and suffering first. Ranking the reasons of why people aren't Christians based on various formal and informal conversations. This is my ranking. Number 1, problem of evil and suffering in the world. Number 2, science, evolutionary theory, criticisms of Noah's flood. And number 3, hypocrisy in the church. This talk deals with number 1 and number 2. So from the father of evolutionary theory himself, Charles Darwin, he says, 1 cannot look at this universe with all living productions in man without believing that all has been intelligently designed. Yet when I look to each individual organisms, I could see no evidence of this. He's dead wrong about that. I'll try to explain a little bit why. Like many of us, he has this paradoxical observation. On the one hand, we see organs of extreme perfection and complication in biology. Those were his words. Extreme perfection and complication. Yet on the other hand, he sees the suffering in the world. And this is what he said. What a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, wasteful, blundering, low, and horridly cruel works of nature. And these views are echoed in modern literature by people like Darwin. Like William Bialek, he's a biophysicist. We'll talk plenty about him today. He's advocating that life is more perfect than we imagined, And even Dawkins and Dennett will argue, yeah, life is very, very well designed. And yet Dawkins will also say, look, the world's a horrible place. It's like it's run by the devil. So paradoxical views. And so 3 of Charles Darwin's children died while Darwin was alive. The loss of Annie Darwin on the left was particularly devastating to Charles. He said, this very old argument from the existence of suffering against the existence of an intelligent first cause seems to me a strong one. So let me pause here. I'll try to interpret this. The way I read it is the problem of evil is making him think there's no intelligent first cause, meaning God. That just doesn't seem like the way his idea of God says, such a God wouldn't do this. All right, moving on. He writes, the presence of much suffering agrees well with the view that all organic beings have been developed through variation and so-called natural selection. So the suffering in the world motivated him to reject God and also accept natural selection as the answer. Darwin missed the mark. He had a few things right, but he missed the mark. He was not far away from Christian theology, but like sin, which misses the mark, he missed it, but he was getting in the right direction. Christian creationist theology is life in the universe are intelligently designed, but also cursed and in need of a savior. But why should this be so? A question that is often posed: why would an all-wise, loving God allow children to have cancer, blindness, or early death? Answer by some Christians is God made the world perfect, but then man sinned and let all the bad happen because God cursed the world. That is an answer, but it doesn't answer the question. Because that response raises even more troubling questions, which most Christians can't answer. This is a family-friendly portrayal of Eve being tempted by the devil, the serpent from Genesis chapter 3. It's family-friendly because Eve is wearing a nice outfit instead of wearing no outfit at all. So why would God allow evil in the world at all? If God didn't make the snake, there would be no sin entering into the world. Therefore, there would be no suffering, no curse. Many people, including lifelong pastors, have very poor answers to this question. A lot of people will leave the faith because of this. A lot of people will reject intelligent design. That's why I'm covering it. This question will negate almost anything I do as far as the science. It says in Genesis 3, now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord had made. So question, was the serpent, the devil, the product of intelligent design? My answer is yes. So there's a two-part answer to the problem of evil. It comes from the scriptures, 2 Corinthians 4:17 and Deuteronomy 13. The first part of the answer is 2 Corinthians, and the way I'll explain it is appealing to Snow White. Now, Snow White is a fictitious story that is deeply at the core of our collective consciousness. I'm talking about the traditional story of Snow White, not the abomination Disney is currently making, but thankfully predicted to bomb at the box office this year. The value of the traditional Snow White story is that it expresses our deepest longings to make sense of an evil world, whether we realize it or not. One day I took 10 to 15 minutes to read the entire story of Snow White to my Bible study. But here is a 1-minute summary. Snow White is exceptionally beautiful, but her mother dies. Snow White's father remarries, and Snow White gets an evil queen stepmother who is jealous of Snow White's beauty and wants to kill her. The evil queen stepmother succeeds in killing Snow White, and Snow White is put in a glass coffin. The prince who loves her finds her too late, as she is already dead. But when the prince kisses her, it miraculously causes her to come back to life. The prince destroys the evil queen, and Snow White and the prince live happily ever after. So after I read the entire story to my Bible study, I asked the Bible study to consider, what if there were no evil queen and no death of Snow White? Would the story be as beautiful and heartwarming and as meaningful? They all said no, it'd be like nothing. It'd be sterile. I call it the Snow White principle. At least ponder this idea and see if you can get around the need of a villain in a story in order to have the story glorify the hero of the story and also have a happy ending. Just munch on that a little bit. So I call this the Snow White principle. Tragedy and evil are necessary components of a beautiful story with a happy ending. So if there is a resurrection from the dead, a brief momentary tragedy, it is made into a beautiful happily ever after. The Apostle Paul had his version of the Snow White principle. For this momentary light affliction is building for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. The story of Christ's resurrection is central to the Christian faith because it gives us the hope that all these tragedies will have a happy ending. And so now the other question is, did God ordain this meeting between the devil and Eve? Was that meeting a product of a conscious, intelligent decision by God? The answer by me is yes. Yes. God, like many of us, is seeking out true, tested, and trustworthy love. That's why he allowed the snake to be in the Garden of Eden. This may be a hard pill to swallow, but God's first priority is not our happiness or our health, but rather that he be glorified and that he is loved by us. And the verse I'll appeal to is Deuteronomy 13, 1-3. If a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises among you and gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or wonder that he tells you comes to pass, and if he says, let us go after other gods which we have not known, and let us serve them, you shall not listen to the words of that prophet or dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul. And that, in those two verses, 2 Corinthians 4:17, Deuteronomy 13:1-3, is mostly my answer to the problem of evil. In the interest that this study could go on for 5 hours dealing with children, I'd refer you to 1 Kings chapter 14 about how God killed Jeroboam's son, took the son to heaven, punished Jeroboam. No time for that. I'm sorry. I'd love to talk about it more. 5-hour Bible study. But switching gears on a related topic, a mathematical engineering perspective on the problem of supposed bad design and designed errors. This parallels the problem of evil. So a generic evolutionary propagandist, was wailing on the internet. He said, why would God make DNA repair mechanisms? If God were competent, he wouldn't allow DNA to need repair to begin with. Obviously, he didn't know about Shannon's noisy channel coding theorem. Claude Shannon is the father of the information age. There is a corollary and consequence of the noisy channel coding theorem. Allowing errors is vital to the modern information age. And this is in evidence by the Reed-Solomon error correction. It is a strategy whereby you do allow errors to be made and then you correct them later. So if the goal is making a device that can store the most data, then storing the data with errors and correcting it later is optimal. That's why it's brilliant design to allow DNA to be damaged and then repaired. The proof of this is just miserable, but we have to move on. And I have to skip all this other good stuff about the problem of evil, maybe another day. So now let's talk about design in biology. We'll talk about William Bialek, Princeton University biophysicist. He argues life is more perfect than we imagined. And in evolutionary biology, ironically, there is a spectrum of views. On the one hand, on the left, Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins say biology is engineering. It's exquisitely designed, albeit through Darwinism, not miracles of God. On the other end of the spectrum, we have people like Jerry Coyne and Nathan Lentz. They say biology is designed as if pieces of junk were cobbled together. Examples claimed are supposed junk DNA, human legs, human arms, Achilles tendon, and human eye, and let's cover that. So how about junk DNA? Billions are being spent on discovering that junk DNA isn't junk, but exquisitely designed to make multicellular creatures function. One example of the paper, and we can't get into it, is that the ALU elements, which make up a lot of the genome considered junk, turns out they're very sophisticated server farms. We have like 37 trillion epigenomes in our body, and there are 37 trillion of these separate epigenome computers made possible by ALU elements. It's amazing. For another day. So let's cover this evolutionary evangelist on the upper left. He's a non-engineer. His name is Nathan Lentz. And on the lower right is Stuart Burgess, professor of engineering, 40 years as studying biomechanics. He's a mechanical engineer, a biomechanicist, and a robotics engineer, 40 years versus someone with 0, but he's an evolutionary biologist, Nathan Lentz. So let's see this matchup. Nathan Lentz said in a book, no robot arm will ever be designed to imitate the double bones in the lower arm of humans. And it turned out a review paper in 2021 said, scientific review, peer-reviewed, a review of linkage mechanisms in animal joints and related bio-inspired designs from the prestigious Institute of Physics at the UK. The conclusion of the paper, to advance robotics, engineers need to copy 4-bar linkages found in animals and humans. So score 1 for the creationist, none for the Darwinist. Nathan Lentz loses that round. Then Nathan Lentz keeps at it. He says, no engineer would design an ankle with so many parts. No engineer would design an ankle joint with so many parts. Stuart Burgess responds, I have designed robots using multiple parts like the ankle, for which he won the Wessex Scientific Medal. And to add insult to injury, Stuart Burgess is a creationist. Score 2 for the creationists, 0 for the Darwinists. Nathan Lentz just keeps at it. He loves losing. He said, a modern mechanical engineer, and Lentz isn't a mechanical engineer, he's an evolutionary propagandist. A modern mechanical engineer would never design a joint with such an obvious liability as the Achilles tendon. And a real mechanical engineer of 40 years, Stuart Burgess responds, my spacecraft joints use cables like Achilles tendon, like the Achilles tendon. Yes, they hired him to make these cables up there to make this spacecraft work. And it's like the Achilles tendon, for which he won 3 awards. UK Turner's Gold Medal, Japanese Mitutoyo Prize, UK James Clayton Prize 2019. Score 3 for the creationists, 0 for the Darwinists. Now, has Nathan Lentz retracted after having his head handed to him? No, that's because he's an evolutionary propagandist, not interested in truth. Whereas Stuart Burgess wins awards and the cover story of peer-reviewed scientific journal on bioinspiration and biomimetics, published by the respected Institute of Physics of the UK, he may well be promoted to be editor of that journal. And so score 4-0 for the creationists. Now, Jerry Coyne and others have criticized the human eye. The human eye, he says, though eminently functional, is imperfect. Certainly not the sort of eye an engineer would create. Again, how would he know that? He's not an engineer, never worked on an optical system. I have. And some others have even been more worse in criticizing the human eye. But from the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2007, they said this part of the eye, the Mueller cells, and then they're specifically talking about the problems Jerry Coyne highlighted. They turned it around. They said, this is ingeniously designed. So score 5-0 for the creationists. Now, some little add-ons here. I stopped keeping score. This is just for fun. There's we use wires to transmit electricity. Biology uses quantum tunneling in proteins to transmit electricity. So this is the Proceedings, National Academy of Sciences, 2018. You'll hear from James Tour, but this is so beautiful. This is from him. Microelectronics processor functioning with the capacity of a human brain would need at least 10 megawatts to operate. This is equivalent to the output of a small hydroelectric power plant. The human brain needs only 10 watts. Only 10 watts. This is because of homochirality and chiral-induced spin selectivity. He may cover that in his talk. This is how well biology is designed. So it's not surprising so many engineers are coming to the faith. They look at what they build and then they compare it to what is seen in biology and they think, man, a mind far greater than me has created this. There has got to be a God. There has got to be a God. So let's talk about William Bialek. He says their life is more perfect than we imagine. A reporter by the name of Natalie Angier, she's a stark raving atheist, but she interviewed William Bialek, and the way she reported this story in the New York Times, she's a Pulitzer Prize winner, you'd almost think she's a creationist the way she reported it. So let me read the parts of the article to you. It's just beautiful. She writes, photoreceptors operate at the outermost boundary allowed by the laws of physics, which means they are as good as they can be, period. Each one is designed to detect and respond to single photons of light, the smallest possible packages in which light comes wrapped. Photoreceptors exemplify the principle of optimization, an idea gaining ever wider traction among researchers. For example, the way a shark can find its prey by measuring microfluxes of electricity in water, a tremulous millionth of a volt strong, which, as Douglas Fields observed in Scientific American, is like detecting an electric field generated by a standard AA battery with one pole dipped in the Long Island Sound and the other pole in the waters of Jacksonville, Florida. In each instance, biophysicists have calculated the system couldn't get faster, more sensitive, or more efficient without first relocating to an alternate universe with alternate physical constants. Dr. Emmanuel Todorov has studied how we use our muscles. And here too, he finds evidence of optimization at play. You might say, well, the human body is sloppy. He said, but no, we're better designed. We are better designed than any robot. So take that, Nathan Lentz. The brain too seems built to tolerate bloopers and static hiss. Bloopers and static hiss, as in errors. Simon Laughlin of Cambridge University has proposed that the brain's wiring system has been maximally miniaturized, condensed for the sake of speed to the physical edge of signal fidelity. Again, echoes of Shannon's noisy channel coding theorem and things like error correction like Reed-Solomon, and the optimality of allowing errors and then error correction. Now, a little bit going more. Almost any engineer involved in the industry of aviation and maritime navigation might wonder how a monarch butterfly can navigate thousands of miles using a magnetic compass system smaller than a pinhead. Quantum physicists marvel at the bird's ability to navigate by sensing magnetic fields, by possibly leveraging aspects of quantum spin chemistry that exceed the best comparable man-made molecular systems. So, being a pilot, a magnetic compass was my least favorite device for navigating. I'd probably be dead if I didn't have all the other things to help me. But magnetic navigation, what would you need for that? You would need to start creating charts by first exploring and hopefully getting back home alive so you could report on it. You'd need very precise clocks and calendars. And even in the 20th century, we had airplanes that had just like huge panels of navigation equipment. There's the navigator on an airplane there. And yet birds seem to be able to do navigation so effortlessly without all that. So consider the Arctic tern. Some scientists state the yearly migration can range from 44,000 miles to 59,000 miles. An Arctic tern in its lifespan typically flies a distance equivalent to 3 round trips to the moon. Three round trips to the moon. It can navigate to the same nesting grounds with no printed maps. Try doing that in an airplane without any navigation equipment. And another bird, the bar-tailed godwit. Its range without refueling, the record set was 8,435 miles from Alaska to the Australian state of Tasmania. Its flight endurance was 300 hours without stopping for food or rest. It was flying 230 hours straight. For me, it's the most fuel efficient flying machine known. It only weighs 10 ounces. It uses a mental map for navigation, which includes star charts inside its head and a beak compass. Now compare this to a military drone, an advanced military drone called the Phoenix Ghost. It weighs 21 pounds. Its flight time before refueling is only 1 to 2 hours. Its range is only 75 miles. So let's take one component of the bird, just its magnetic compass. Now, just as a caveat here, this is not, there's still some dispute, but let me read this, take it for what it is, and just accept that caveat for now. This is, this is really technical, but I want you to get a feel for how high the tech involved is in a magnetic compass. This is from the American Physical Review Letters. Sustained quantum coherence and entanglement in the avian compass. In artificial systems, quantum superposition and entanglement typically decay rapidly unless cryogenic temperatures are used. That's like close to absolute zero. Could life have evolved to exploit such delicate phenomenon? Certain migratory birds have the ability to sense very subtle variations in the Earth's magnetic field. Here we apply quantum information theory and the widely accepted radical pair model to analyze recent experimental observations of the avian compass. We find that the superposition and entanglement are sustained in this living system for at least tens of microseconds, exceeding the durations achieved in the best comparable man-made molecular systems. This conclusion is starkly at variance with the view that life is too warm and wet for such quantum phenomenon to endure. Notwithstanding the cautions I said, it's not 100% sure this is right. you could still see that this is a complicated machine, better than anything we made. It made the cover of Nature, the quantum compass, magnetically sensitive protein in migratory birds. And this thing is really tiny. It's as small as a bird's eye, actually less than a bird's eye, because it's only, the compass is inside the bird's eye. It's only one component of the bird's eye. Let's contrast this with a man-made quantum magnetic compass. This is a man-made quantum magnetic compass. We have our best physicists and engineers working on this. Is it not surprising that engineers are starting to come to faith? They look at what we made and then they compare that to what's in nature. And it's hard not to think, oh, why? Only God could have made that. So now we're going to talk about quasi-particles. This is a little more technical. Quasi-particles have been awarded at least 3 Nobel Prizes, possibly more, to discoveries related to quasi-particles, and 8 individuals were awarded the Nobel Prize in quasi-particle research. The semiconductor industry is driven, the $500 billion a year industry is driven by quasi-particle technology. It's in the field called solid state physics. Now, solid state physics is referred to as squalid state physics by other physicists. It's squalid in the context of solid state physics is a derogatory term, sometimes used by physicists in other fields to describe the field as being dirty or intellectually less significant, implying research is focused on the mundane practical applications rather than fundamental questions. This part was AI generated, by the way. So they kind of look down on this because it's used for practical applications, like say the $500 billion a year semiconductor industry, which makes our smartphones, internet, radios, computers, radar, etc. So it's just funny to hear that. So this is squalid state physics. So a dictionary definition is that squalid means dirty, or showing or involving a contemptible lack of moral standards. So squalid state physicists are bad boys of physics, showing or involving a contemptible lack of moral standards. All right, so these are what we normally think of as particles, the particles of an atom, subatomic particles. This is high school physics, proton, neutron, electron. When you get beyond, like when you get your PhD, you'll learn about other particles in physics, standard particles. But in squalid state physics, you have quasi-particles, and I'll describe what they are later in a little bit. But I want you to see the long list of them. They have all these cool lists of particles with cool names, like dropleton. There's like a dropleton, and a dislon, and a leviton. And look at all these cool quasi-particles, so many of them. And the list will continue to grow, by the way. I expect it to grow. It's not going to be limited to this. And this is why they think this is just like so distasteful to physicists. You know, a physicist who wants a theory of everything thinks that people that just make things more complicated, you know, they're showing or involving a contemptible lack of moral standards, because this is anti-theory of everything. We're just making their headaches worse. So 2 quasi-particles of interest that are in the semiconductor industry and in biology, the electron hole and the exciton. When I studied biochemistry in the later chapter of my textbook from Leniger Principles, it mentioned the exciton. And when I saw that, I'm like, that's advanced semiconductor physics. What's that doing in biology? And sure enough, the more I learned, man-made exciton transfer is involved in solar cells. So man-made exciton transfer combined with other factors result in solar cells that are only 14% energy efficient in converting sunlight to energy. Only 14% efficient. Whereas God-made exciton transfer is 100% efficient. I mean, is it any surprise that intelligent design is starting to inspire engineers, because they work with this every day? They look at biology and they say something made this, something far greater than all of us put together is made biology. So now let's look at, let me try to explain a quasi-particle. These are metaphors as best as I could do. We can consider this dot made by a laser pointer. you can model the dot as an object. Okay, just model it as an object, just, hypothetically. It has an XY position and it also has a velocity over time. So you could say that's an object. Now for quasi-particles, consider this row of negatively charged hypothetical particles. These are hypothetical. And now consider that we start to move these negative charges to the left, one object at a time. You'll notice that there's a space moving to the right simultaneously. Now, just to emphasize the point, let us make that space and call it a positive charge with space, with charge and mass. And you could see that as we move the negative charges to the left, the positive charges move to the right. And this is by way of, again, this is just hypothetical. But because of quantum mechanics, these empty spaces, these holes, can be treated as mass and charge, with mass as having mass and charge inside a solid object, because the object allows it to be modeled that way. That's because all the atoms in the solid contribute to that effect. That's why it's not merely empty space. So you can treat this empty space, this hole, as a real object with mass, charge, position, velocity, even though it's sort of not there. Okay, that's the best I could do. This is the collective effect of the entire solid. It won't work outside the solid in empty space. You need the solid to make this magic happen. And that happens in semiconductors. We have p-type semiconductors and n-type semiconductors for you electrical engineers out there. The p-type, the hole is the charge carrier, and in the n-type, it's the electron. And so we have transistors often labeled as PNP or NPN, where you take a p-type and sandwich in an n-type, or vice versa. You sandwich a p-type in between two n-type materials. And the guys who just made this little sandwich, well, they won the Nobel Prize for discovering the transistor effect. Yes, it was that simple. Amazing. Serendipity. By the way, Shockley, who won the Nobel Prize, they pretty much realized he discovered this by accident. This was not intentional design. So there you go. So we have this hole in the p-type semiconductor. Now biology takes this a step further. It also creates holes in its solid state physics. And so there's a squalid state physics physicist up there in the sky. So I don't know if you could see my pointer here. So when a light ray hits a plant and hits the magnesium atom, it excites the electron. The electron moves out of the valence band and it creates a hole. Again, this hole is not just empty space. It can be modeled as having charge and mass. So it basically creates a positive charge here. Now, the positive charge hole and the negative charge electron can then have a neutral charge, which allows them to mitigate Ohm's law and move with less energy than charged particles. And by the way, LEDs make light by destroying excitons. It's kind of the reverse process is what the plant does, just as a FYI. This neutral charge has been now finally observed in metal. So just recently, fast-moving excitons observed for the first time in metal, unlocking potential to speed up digital communications. But God made designs where we had excitons being able to travel through biological systems, through plants. We actually don't know how it's able to do this with 100% efficiency. Our engineers don't know how to make excitons move this well. So I'm gonna just move on from that. I just wanted to see the wonders of biology here. There is one other one that we're starting to learn about, the polaron. There's a picture on the right there of polarons through scanning electron microscopy or something like that, something called STM, scanning tunneling microscopy, I'm sorry. And so we could see these things. These are quasi-particles. And we found polarons in DNA. So now I'm going to move on from polarons just to close out the idea. I want you to think about this title, Catalysis of Transmutations by Heavy Electron Quasi-Particles and Crystallites. This I'd say is only maybe, I give it a 40% chance of being right, but I'm excited because the Army Corps of Engineers has been using tens of millions of your taxpayer dollars to research cold fusion. They are firing lasers on palladium and making silicon, and I think these heavy electron quasi-particles can explain it. They make possible an imitation of muon catalyzed fusion. No time to talk about it. The naval space warfare systems is also weighing in. More of your taxpayer dollars going into cold fusion research. You may not have known that. And also the NASA Glenn Research Center. So quasi-particles are cool. Here are more experimental evidences. If you want to talk about that, we can. But I just wanted to say, why would you want to study evolutionary theory? We have all this cool stuff happening and the frontiers are great. Why is this important to young Earth creationism? It may solve the heat problem and also radiometric problems. This is going to be an important area of research, in my opinion. Whether that succeeds or not, we'll see, but it's going to be a cool field of study. So now in closing, I'm going to just run out my time. We won't have time for questions in this segment. I'll join for the Q&A. So William Bialek, he said, is Darwinism the best explanation for why life is more perfect than we imagined? Why it's built with organs of extreme perfection and complication? Honestly, if you listen to William Bialek, you'd think he was a creationist right up until the end of his lecture when he gives glory to Darwin, which is kind of sad. So recall that in 2025, famous evolutionary biologist Brett Weinstein said, modern Darwinism is broken. My Darwinist colleagues are lying to themselves. So how did Darwinists lie to themselves and deceive the world? I'll talk about it by extracting some of the highlights of my peer-reviewed reference chapter published through Springer Nature that's now in the collection of many secular university libraries. I co-authored it with John Sanford and 2 other outstanding scientists, especially Ola Hasjer, who is a population geneticist and received Sweden's highest national award in mathematics. That's on the lower panel there. That's Ola Hasjer and my co-authors. This was a page from our actual work, but don't worry, I'll give you the plain English version of this. When our reference chapter was first published, the book our chapter was printed in retailed for $1,500, but you can get the gist of what we wrote for free, plus some extras in this presentation. So get yours while supplies last. According to abiogenesis and evolutionary theories, lifeless chemicals self-organized into the first life through a process of abiogenesis, and then this first life evolved over billions of years to become all the variety of forms in existence today, from simple to complex. A definition of evolution, according to the Evolution Berkeley website, is biological evolution, simply put, is descent with heritable natural modifications. Modification is descent with heritable natural modification. Now, I inserted the word natural because they assume nothing supernatural is needed, which I think is reasonable as a start. But that's an assumption only, not an experimental fact. What began to lead me to think about the supernatural is that all the experiments are showing that the direct real-time experiments have shown repeatedly that the natural tendency is for organisms and systems to de-evolve from complex to simple, from organized to less organized, sometimes even in one generation. And this leads to a paradox, because if the natural, dare I say, the dominant mode of evolution is simplification and disorganization, how can life evolve from a simple cell to become such a wide variety of complex forms over time? Why is it that I can now make this claim that the dominant mode of evolution is simplification and not evolution toward organs of extreme perfection and complication? I couldn't have made this argument 20 years ago, but I can today. So when I was on the cover of Nature 20 years ago, I couldn't make this argument, but today I can. The reason is the cost of genome sequencing is 1,000,000 times cheaper than 22 years ago, 1,000,000 times cheaper. Through genome sequencing in real time, we can now clearly see that Darwin was wrong. Case in point, the top evolutionary biologist on the planet, Eugene Koonin, along with lead author Yuri Wolf, wrote the paper entitled genome reduction as the dominant mode of evolution. Genome reduction, that is loss of genes and DNA, as the dominant mode of evolution. Quantitatively, the evolution of genomes appears to be dominated by reduction and simplification, punctuated by episodes of unexplained complexification. I emphasize the word that I inserted, unexplained. If they added the word unexplained, that would have been a far more accurate statement. Incidentally, there is Eugene Koonin, pictured with the staff of evolutionary biologists working for him at the NIH. Included in the picture is one of my professors in graduate school. Dr. Sanford paid out of his own pocket so that I could study there. And my orders from Dr. Sanford, go to the NIH, study under the best. And so that's how I learned about Koonin. Koonin points out one example of a parasite that can lose 95% of its genes. And this is ubiquitous. Another experiment, the title is Genomes Decay Despite Sustained Fitness Gains. Genomes decay despite sustained fitness gains. Translation, so-called natural selection in reality leads to simplicity, not complexity. Darwin's imagination is backwards from reality. We now know this experimentally. I nominate Darwin for a Darwin Award. More titles, Evolution by Gene Loss. And this Oxford University Press paper, gene loss is a key evolutionary force. And it says gene losses are pervasive. Gene losses are pervasive throughout the tree of life, leaving little doubt of their great potential as a key evolutionary force. The authors don't quite come to terms with the fact that genes need to be added rather than lost over time for evolution to work. Even the dog reacted to this paper by saying, say what? See, the dog can't believe what he's reading. Another one about natural selection. This paper, selection-driven gene loss. And yet another one, gene loss predictably drives evolutionary adaptation. By the way, look at the dates of these papers. They're recent, relatively recent. This is actually by Michael Behe. He was kind of the pioneer of some of this. He said, experimental evolution, loss of function mutations, the first rule of adaptive evolution. And here are some amusing bonus examples. Intelligence and childlessness. Population IQ is dropping because less intelligent women have the most babies relative to intelligent high IQ women. That's a testable hypothesis, by the way, which is kind of sad. And this New York Times bestseller said, people with certain heritable conditions, such as obesity, a tendency to diabetes, Tay-Sachs disease, sickle cell anemia, are more evolutionarily fit. Okay, and then here's the paper. What are the evolutionary advantages of premenstrual syndrome? So, okay, so you single guys out there who are looking for Miss Right, listen up. According to evolutionary biology, not me, evolutionary biology, if you find a girl and she's not that intelligent, and she has a list of heritable diseases listed in this book, and she has lots of premenstrual syndrome, you may have found yourself a keeper. So where does this go wrong? I know I'm running out of time. Defining the fittest and fitness, describing falsely labeled natural selection. Herbert Spencer and Charles Darwin describe natural selection as survival of the fittest. Darwin claims that as the fittest survive through each generation, this leads to increases in capability over time that natural selection will construct organs of extreme perfection and complication. The flaw in Darwin's theory is how one defines the fittest, and that flaw is fatal to Darwin's theory. Darwinists use equivocation, where they use multiple meanings of the same word to make illogical and deceptive claims. So let me go over equivocation. This is a classic logical fallacy. So here are three statements and a conclusion. The first statement is true. A feather is light. A feather is light. And the second statement is true. What is light cannot be dark. Something that is light cannot be dark. That's a true statement. A false statement combines the two true statements. If you say, therefore, a feather cannot be dark, that's a false statement. First of all, you could cheat and say, well, obviously we have dark feathers, so that's not, if you don't want to go through the logic or the illogic of this, figure out what's the problem. Experiment and observation trumps all logic, okay? You have to deal with it. So let's just parse this apart. So a feather is light. So when we use light, which I highlighted in blue, that means light as in not heavy. That's one meaning of light. Whereas in the second usage of light, that means light as in not dark. So when you start mixing meanings and introducing two meanings of one word, two or more meanings of one word into the same argument, you get all sorts of illogical conclusions. And evolutionary theory, as I've read it, is rife with equivocations. Oh my goodness, it's practically built on equivocations, non sequiturs, false assertions, circular reasoning. I mean, you could write a textbook on how to make illogical, logical fallacies and, dishonest rhetoric. That's evolutionary theory. Whether they mean to or not, that's the way it is. And to emphasize the mess of multiple meanings, if you think I'm making this up, and equivocations of evolutionary fitness, consider Richard Lewontin. He says, it's not entirely clear what fitness is. I'm like, yeah, duh. He wrote a peer-reviewed article from Harvard, and he uses the word incommensurability. The incommensurability of Darwinian fitness. That means, kind of the multiple meanings of it. He's addressing that. He sees that as a problem. Some other evolutionary biologists. Fitness is difficult to define properly and nearly impossible to measure rigorously. An unassailable measurement of any organism's fitness an unassailable measurement of any organism's fitness does in practice not exist. And Gillespie, a population geneticist, says of the frequency changes or the levels of evolutionary fitness that are low, they are impossible to measure, which is mostly the case. They're mostly impossible to measure. This is a bad situation, guys. If you want to have a scientific theory, you better be able to define your quantities, like say in physics, that would be like length, mass, time, and charge. You have to be able to measure that. You can't do that in evolutionary theory. You can't define it. You can't measure it. It's a terrible theory for natural selection. And and to drive the point home more, I just did this generative AI search. I asked the computer, why is evolutionary fitness an ill-defined concept? And it responded, evolutionary fitness is an ill-defined concept because it is highly context dependent. Skipping ahead. Evolutionary fitness is not an inherent property of an organism, but rather a measure of its reproductive success, aka copying efficiency. And to make matters worse, here's an evolutionary biologist. He says evolutionary biologists may be deluding themselves. This is from the prestigious scientific journal Nature. Evolutionary biologists may be deluding themselves. I think it would be more correct if he changed that to maybe to are. Evolutionary biologists are deluding themselves if they think they have a good handle on the typical strength of selection in nature. So evolutionary biologists lie to themselves and are deluding themselves. Am I the one making these accusations? I'm merely pointing out evolutionary biologists are saying that about each other. So, okay, I have 8 minutes. In modern evolutionary theoretical genetics, evolutionary fitness is a measure of copy efficiency for a given environment. And you could see how to calculate this from my paper, my peer-reviewed paper, on Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection. If you want to really torture yourself, go to Joe Felsenstein's theoretical evolutionary genetics. So again, think of evolutionary fitness as a measure of copying efficiency, not whether the species has complex designs such as the human brain. In the evolutionary view, a set of nincompoops with 14 kids, like Octomom on the left, are more evolutionary fit than a set of brilliant individuals with only one kid, like Richard Dawkins on the right. The estimated time to copy the phrase to be or not to be, that is the question, takes about 1 minute. To copy the Bible by hand, that would take 3 years. And in parallel, bacteria can make copies of themselves in 20 minutes. A human takes 10,512 minutes. So in absolute evolutionary fitness, which's more fit, the bacteria or humans? The problem posed here is the tendency toward efficient recopying of DNA letters. It's on painful display. It was first on painful display in this experiment, the Spiegelman monster experiment. Spiegelman made an artificial life form in a test tube using biological parts of living cells like a Frankenstein. Instead, he used RNA instead of DNA for its genome. Since it's faster to copy a small genome versus a larger one, we would expect a Darwinian process of so-called survival of the fittest to naturally lead to smaller rather than larger genomes. And that's what happened. People should have been alarmed at this result. They just ignored it. Now consider this lady with the big backpack. She's equipped for touring remote, desolate environments that don't have a lot of amenities. The lady with the small handbag, she's equipped for touring urban environments that have a lot of amenities, like Las Vegas, Nevada. So why carry around more than you need for a given environment? That's one illustration I'll appeal to in a little bit. Another illustration, and this is from the book of Acts, but it's an illustration of a crew of a sinking ship throwing cargo overboard to save the ship. So just think about the illustrations of letting go of things you don't need immediately, You might need it in the future, but you're so desperate, you're just gonna dispose of stuff immediately. And this applies to biological systems that migrate from one environment to another. So you have E. coli with a lot of genes, 10,000 or so, and E. coli with a few genes. We see this on display when E. coli migrates to other environments. Often it will lose genes. And again, remember, genome reduction is the dominant mode of evolution. And so we had this 80,000 generation experiment, the long-term evolution experiment by Richard Lenski. The thing lost a lot of genes. Granted, it got some new function, new alleles, some regulatory changes, but it lost many genes, and one could argue it gained zero genes. So this is like a football score, creationists 200, Darwinists 2. So, I'd be depressed if this happened to me as an experimenter and I were an evolutionist, but well, he still got paid, so maybe that's why he's still happy. Rob Stadler covered an example of the gene for the tryptophan synthase. There's the DCS example, which I think is also compelling. And it shows that once a gene is broken, it stays broken. I interviewed Scott Minnick on this issue. And this also falsified Dawkins' weasel simulation, which he claims proves natural selection. It didn't. It was a deceptive simulation because this wasn't an experiment. He used the weasel simulation to argue the blind watchmaker. Sadly, by the way, and he also wrote other books like A Devil's Chaplain. And he wrote, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no God. Sadly, one student at the prompting of his biology professor read the works of Richard Dawkins, and he was misled by Dawkins, concluded life had no meaning, and committed suicide. The young man's name is Jesse Kilgore. Darwinism is bad science and inspires a dark religion. And if you doubt me, Michael Ruse, who's an atheist, agnostic, he wrote a book through Oxford University Press, Darwinism as Religion. So in the space of time, I'm going to play this clip. Let me unshare let me reshare this. This is probably less than a minute. And if anyone wants to talk about this in the Q&A, we can. I'll let all the other guys answer questions in the QA, and anyone wanting to be tortured at the end, we could do this, but let me just play this in the meantime. See if I have to figure out how to get this to go. Let's get it to go.
On that, we agree. As you said, like we agree that proteins, unlike cellular life, do not share universal common ancestry, right? We disagree about cellular life, but we agree that proteins don't share universal common ancestry.
Proteins don't share universal common ancestry.
So with that, thank you for joining me. I know I ran right to the end. It was a pleasure. God bless you all. Take care.
Thank you so much, Sal. It's been an honor and a joy to listen to you today. Looking forward to the Q&A. So glad you're able to join us then. And I'll turn it over to Kirk to introduce our next guest.
Sounds good. And I'm actually really looking forward to our next presenter, Dr. Joel Brown. Reason for that is one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for me personally was the discovery of soft dinosaur tissue. And so he'll be covering some of that. So Dr. Brown has a PhD in genetics, genomics, and development from Cornell University. He holds a bachelor's in biology education from Pensacola Christian College and a master's in biology from the University of West Florida. So without further ado, Dr. Brown, welcome to the Creation Summit. Thank you.